Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we are now entering day 26 of the ongoing war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. And today, what I immediately wanted to try and talk about and discuss a little bit is some of the Russian both missile, artillery, and airstrike activity that we have been seeing, and I wanted to try and apply some reason to what we're seeing. And first and foremost, I would say that obviously, unfortunately, yes, civilian targets are being struck by Russian missiles and military assets in terms of, in some cases, very, very large munitions indeed. Now, with that being said, we've seen recently on the outskirts of Kiev that a fairly large shopping mall, which was claimed by the Ukrainians, was hit by the Russian military and really kind of rubbleized. Now, first, what you also have to consider is the military targets that have been hit prior. So you have to assume that most of the Ukrainian military bases where active Ukrainian military brigades were originally based, along with their barracks for individual soldiers and obviously motor pools for equipment, has been probably struck multiple times by the Russian military. And unfortunately for the Ukrainians, they've had to then find other places to warehouse and billet some of those forces. And obviously this is an actual real life battlescape in which we've seen the Russians destroy a lot of barracks facilities, and again, these military bases that the Ukrainians would ordinarily use. So if those bases have been destroyed, it is normal that a military unit fighting within their areas of operation would seek the closest possible abandoned civilian area to either billet some troops to get them out of the weather, and also in some cases quite possibly hide equipment such as main battle tanks, armored infantry fighting vehicles. Now, I'm not saying that was absolutely done in this case of the shopping mall. The Russians are reporting that is why they struck the shopping mall, because Ukrainian forces were using the shopping mall as a base of operations. Not only as a base of operations, but an area where they could get out of the elements, seek shelter, and do maintenance on vehicles. You could obviously, if it's a large mall, you could quite possibly pull vehicles into the mall itself, out of the elements. Again, it's cold in Ukraine right now. You have snow, you have rain, and inherently soldiers will like to get out of those elements. And again, if your bases have been destroyed or your bases are a significant distance from where you are currently fighting, it is completely reasonable for those Ukrainian units to then kind of coalesce in some of these civilian areas, such as the shopping mall incident we have recently seen. So again, it would not be out of the realm of possibility for the Ukrainian military to have been actively using that shopping mall in some sort of military capacity, and the Russians believed at that point that it was a legitimate military target, and that is why they struck it. And we will continue to see this happen throughout this war. And again, this is nothing new. Again, I think many individuals went into this conflict believing, some of these talking heads on the media, that this would be a 3-day war and the Russians would win very, very quickly. And, again, I think the Russians had a plan to attempt to win very quickly, but I don't think they were under any misconception that it could turn into what we're seeing today. And it does appear, at least, the Russians have prepared for that and are continuing the operation. Obviously, if the Russians believed that their initial operations would have been so successful in terms of decapitating Kiev, they would not have built this force construct that we see now, in excess of 200,000 troops that were originally deployed all around the Ukraine. So again, the Russians most likely have had contingency plans for this sort of conflict. Now, with that being said, they probably hoped that the Ukrainian military would capitulate rather quickly and they wouldn't have to do the sort of fighting that we're seeing now. But again, in war, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. So the Russians have gone from plan A to plan B, and this is what we're seeing now is plan B. And we've seen very, very few wars in history in terms of where you're seeing both societies invest in what you would define as total war last just a few days or a couple of weeks. So again, this conflict looks to drag on for some time until we have a clear victor, or one of the sides is in a position where it can dictate surrender terms or dictate the best possible outcome for a political solution. And right now that appears to be the Russians looking to change the battlescape and change what is happening on the battlefield so they can come to the table in the best possible, strongest terms for possible negotiations in terms what the Russians would like Ukraine to look like going forward. And they're not there yet. It's going to take some time for the Russians to wear down the Ukrainians until the battlescape and the ability of the Ukrainian military has been degraded to such an extent that the Ukrainians are actually willing to start quite possible surrender talks. And I think that's what the Russians are looking for in terms of what they are doing right now. But again, I believe that we have looked too closely at some recent wars, such as the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Again, in the annals of military history, that is something that is not really normal in terms of war. And again, the Iraqi military was horrid, much worse than the anticipated opposition that the Russians would see from the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians are a much better armed forces, a much better prepared armed forces that are actively being supported by the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, both in terms of weapons and intelligence, and I've talked about that before. And that's why this conflict is evolving and moving the way you see it. Again, it's very difficult to compare and contrast what happened in Iraq in 2003 and the U.S. march up towards Baghdad to this campaign. This is a much more difficult campaign, and I do not believe you can make an accurate assessment of the Russian military based on what is happening in Ukraine. I believe if this was the Baltics and the Russians had turned their attention towards the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, or one of them at a time, obviously this would look a lot different. But again, the Ukrainian military, after 2014, really got its act together in terms of preparing for future war. And again, the Ukrainian military that you're seeing now fighting the Russians is a far better military than what Saddam Hussein's Iraq challenged the United States with. Again, you cannot compare the two. Completely different. And then in regards to Yugoslavia, obviously a much different campaign in terms of what the war goals and the war aims of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the United States, was against the Serbians. And again, just very, very difficult to compare and contrast those two conflicts. Again, Yugoslavia and the invasion of Iraq to what we're seeing right now in Ukraine. Ukraine is a completely different animal, and I would wager that if the United States had to invade Ukraine, we would see maybe not the same sorts of challenges that the Russians are dealing with, but again, it would be much, much more difficult than what the United States faced in Iraq. And again, I don't believe the media talking heads, even a lot of these generals who got the call completely wrong in the first stage of this conflict. Most of these generals were talking that this war would last 3 days and the Russians would be victorious. Now they've done a completely 360 and are basically trying to articulate how the Ukrainians are in fact winning this war, and that's not the case. That's not what's happening. Because the Russians have not been as successful as many people thought in the first 3 days does not mean they are losing this war. But again, the challenges that any nation state would face when fighting the Ukrainians, I think would be very, very similar to what the Russians are facing right now. Again, the Ukrainians are a very, very tenacious military at this point, and again, being directly supported by Western states in terms of both intelligence and some incredibly advanced military hardware being shipped into Ukraine. And on top of that, we don't know what sort of clandestine military units are actually on the ground assisting the Ukrainians as well. I think it highly probable that elements of CIA and some contract groups are actively on the ground assisting the Ukrainian military on the ground. And again, that's why I think we could see at some point the widening of this conflict. In terms of the battlescape, as we know, the Russians gave an ultimatum to Mariupol to surrender. That has come and gone, and we can probably expect a uptick in Russian military operations within the area of Mariupol. Quite possibly some heavy use of tactical aircraft dropping some extremely large ordnance on Mariupol at this stage. So again, it would not surprise me if that occurs. We're continuing to see the Russians continue to push towards Mykolaiv. Again, that is going to be pivotal if the Russians look to at some point to make a move on Odessa. Again, I think we're weeks, not days out from a move on Odessa. Kharkiv continues to be a challenge for the Russians as well. Again, as I talked about before this conflict even started, that these big cities were going to challenge the Russians, and the Russians would either have to seal these cities off and continue to move on, or face lengthy, drawn-out, urbanized operations in these cities in order to reduce and destroy the opposing forces that are defending from inside these civilian areas. So again, as I've talked about before, as we see the Russians strike civilian targets, again, the Ukrainian military is actively defending from these civilian targets. So, but at the same time, what do you expect the Ukrainians to do? Do you expect them to go out in the middle of a parking lot and say, well, let's fight in the middle of the parking lot and all these buildings are going to be excluded? Let's go over here to the soccer field and fight from a soccer field, or let's go to this field. That's not the way war works. And again, the Russians are responding to that, and you're going to see these civilian targets get hit because there are military units operating from these civilian areas. So again, not going to harp on that too long. I know I'm going to get some pushback on that, but it's just the way it is. It's been like that through history. But again, the Russians continue to use cruise missiles and some of its standoff assets to attack and reduce Ukrainian military units from distance. We're seeing it basically every day now, where a variety of Ukrainian military units are being hit by these cruise missiles or these Iskander ballistic missiles at distance. The Russians are doing the same thing that the Ukrainians are attempting to do to the Russians in terms of to going after leadership targets and rear area operations. The Ukrainians are using TB2 drones and long-range rocket fire and obtaining signals intelligence from the West in terms of where senior leadership of the Russian military are operating from, be it battalion staff officers or brigade staff officers, from generals to colonels. And the Russians are doing the same thing. The Russians are utilizing signal intelligence to launch attacks on Ukrainian, and many Ukrainian generals have been killed as well. Again, that's not being reported. What you are getting is reports of Russian senior generals being killed only from Western media. But I guarantee you the Ukrainians are suffering from the same sort of casualties and losses that the Russians are seeing right now. And I think we're up to 4 or 5, quite possibly, Russian brigadier generals or 1-star generals, and possibly a 2-star general that was killed as well. And then again, we've seen a multitude of regimental leaders, such as colonels, majors, that have been KI'd on the Russian side as well. So, but again, the Russians are doing exactly the same thing, but it's just not being as reported in terms of the casualties that the Ukrainians are sustaining. And believe you me, the Ukrainians are sustaining just as many casualties, if not more, and many more, than the Russians are. But again, this is also a propaganda. You have the normal war, the physical war, then you have the propaganda side of the war. And right now, at least in the West, the Ukrainians are winning the propaganda war. And obviously, Western media is assisting the Ukrainians in that propaganda effort. Now, if you go to Russia or Russian sympathetic states, you're going to get different information. Now, on both sides, that information is not always true. But again, you have to really look at what's happening and try to kind of gray out and not take completely in total what the media is telling you as truth, because again, the Western media, because a lot of it is simply untrue. And again, the same goes with Russian media as well. A lot of what you're hearing is propaganda designed to shape the narrative inside of Russia and keep the Russian population on the side of the Russian government. And this is completely normal in these sorts of conflicts, and this is kind of what we're going to see. But again, I would say that being located in the West, that our media, again, incredibly dishonest. It is not really giving an accurate picture on what is happening on the battlefield and why some things are being done by the Russians that you, the viewer, would perceive as being just completely evil. And again, there is a reason that the Russians are doing what they are indeed doing. That's all we have today, and again, we'll have more very, very soon. Have a good day, everybody.